right on time. So now that we've talked about a lot of data information, you're gonna transition to more what are the consequences of suicide, and specifically what happens to the immortal spirit after that spirit committed suicide. So the objective today is to illustrate the consequences of suicide. How? By analyzing the teachings from the Spiritist doctrine, and also providing an example of a spirit who committed suicide from the book which we have been talking already, which is Memoirs of Suicide. Some initial reflections, and hopefully I'll be able to cover some of the answers and insights and what the literature says about what happens when someone dies abruptly. So I wanted to give you a little bit of explanation of what really happens between dying, the death of the body, and then what happens to the spirit right after. Why does someone who committed suicide suffer? We have been talking about suffering or trying to get rid of suffering while incarnated, but why that suffering will not be eliminated even if we eliminate our body. And last but not least, the divine mercy, and what is the future of someone that committed suicide. Not only the future for a future reincarnation, but actually what happens with that immortal spirit as soon as that mortal spirit takes his or her own life. Love and compassion is present throughout the process. So, starting with Renata, I just want to reemphasize that point where when Renata brought the question 957, when Kardec asks, in general, what are the consequences of suicide on the state of the spirit? And the answers of the spirits are the consequence of suicide vary widely. And this is important. We're going to talk here a little bit of in general terms, but there are so many specific situations that we won't have time enough to cover all the details of all the specific situations that a person committing suicide might face. But there are no set penalties, and in all cases, they're always relative to the case that produced them. And we talked when Sonia was talking about what was the intention behind that act. One consequence from which those who committed suicide cannot escape, however, is the disappointment, which we have been talking since the beginning. We make mistakes. We think that maybe committing suicide, that pain or whatever that person is feeling will be eliminated, but in fact, that will not. Because there's no death. Life continues on, and the sufferer will continue on. So just to give a little bit of explanation about what happens with us. So as you can see here in the picture, we have a kind of silver cord that connects our body to our perispirit, right? And when a person commits suicide, what happens to that silver cord is abruptly cut or abruptly severed. Exactly. And that cord plays such an important role when we disincarnate in a natural way. When we disincarnate in a natural way, when we put our efforts in trying to take care of our purpose in life, in our existential meaning, taking care of developing virtues, or following the divine laws, throughout our life, as we come towards our end of our life, that cord will organically, naturally, starts to be detaching or dissipate. Maybe that's a good word as well. However, when we commit that suicide, it's so abrupt, and there's so much vital energy within us is still that we are not able to release because we decided to end our life before what we were supposed. One example, I myself might be planned, or someone might have planned in their to be incarnated for 70 years, right? If that person decides to take his or her life when, let's say, 40 years, there's still 30 years of vital energy within us that needs to go somewhere, that needs to be dissipated. And we're going to talk about what is the divine mercy from God, how God will help us to keep releasing all that energy that is still in us, that we decided to, because we decided to take up our life, we kind of abruptly end it. And as soon as the spirit take his or her life, because there's so much energy, that spirit will believe that he or she is still alive. And we are going to, as we go through an example of Camilo Castelo Branco, we're going to see everything that he thinks that he's going through. It's all the mental images that he's creating, because that disease, because of suicide, it's that energy is still in him or her. So here is just to reemphasize, even based on Sonia mentioned with unintended suicide, the choices that we make in our life dictates, because of the law of cause and effect, dictates what's going to happen once we disincarnate. If we choose to be moralized, as I mentioned, that cord will be dissipating or being detached as we go through our life. But even if we don't commit suicide and we chose to be on a very material life, living only our passions, that cord will still be firmly attached. And we will have a little bit of a harder time when we disincarnate.
Because of that strong connection.
Because of that strong connection of the material life that we decided. It's all about our decisions. We have free will to decide however we want to live our life. Okay. So, before I talked about question 165, there is a question before where Kardec asks if all spirits will experience a state of confusion. Because as soon as we disincarnate, there is a state of confusion of the spirit. He or she doesn't know exactly what has been happened. However, Kardec asks, is it kind of the same? Is it intense for everyone? Does it take the same amount of time for everyone? And because we know every case is specific, it's no. Every case will be a case, depending, again, the choices that you made to live your life. And I should have put the question here. And the question 165, Kardec actually asks, does the knowledge of Spiritism helps with that state of confusion? Would we go like faster, or we won't be that confused? And he says, it is important. However, what is important and what you did. Did you do the good, the righteousness, and do you have a clear conscience, right? So the knowledge of Spiritism is important, paves the way, but however you decide to use that knowledge is what will dictate that state of confusion, how severe that confusion will be and how long that confusion will be.
So it's not just your knowledge.
It's not just the knowledge.
Actions, how
exactly.
you live your life.
And if you go to the pyramid or the triangle that we study here, it's the knowledge is the first step, right? Mm-hmm. But how do you feel the knowledge and how do you apply that knowledge in your life?
We saw that in the book club, the last book club as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. But as Kardec talks about 165, he starts giving some good hints or information of what happens with a spirit that commits suicide. So at the moment of death, everything appears to be confused at first. In general, as I mentioned, some might be, I think, I didn't read Voltaire, but I think it wasn't there a case, no, the case of Voltaire, he disincarnated, but he didn't know what was happening, right?
Oh,
Or he
was aware of the process, but he did go through some
confusion, yeah. The soul needs some time to recognize itself. If it feels dazed, like someone walking out of a deep sleep who tries to understand the situation. And then Kardec starts saying, this confusion presents particular aspects depending on the character of the individual and especially depending on the type of death involved. In violent deaths, aka suicide, capital punishment is death penalty, accident, stroke, mortal wounds, etc. The spirit is surprised and astonished because it's too abrupt, right? It does not believe itself to be dead, and we're gonna see a clear explanation from Camilo and how he felt as soon as he took his own life. It stubbornly persists in asserting that he has not died.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
In this case, when it's accident, he don't know right away what happened or how you say. When somebody die in accident, the spirit, he's confused, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
he will be confused because the accident is too abrupt, right?
Yeah.
It's too fast. It happens too fast.
And he needs some time to realize what happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that spirit will go to that state of confusion. Again, we don't know exactly the life that spirit will had before the accident. So that state of confusion will vary in terms of how long it will last.
Yeah. In that case, I understand they don't have any punishment because he died in accident. Right?
Every case is a case.
It's a different
Yeah, it's a different case. Yeah, we cannot say
And we need to remember that it's not punishment,
yeah.
consequence.
It's a consequence of a act.
Yeah.
There are so many variables that related to a car accident, for example, that we won't be able to give one answer that, okay, this is what happens.
Yeah, and then what happened when the people is, they have some crime, they did some crime and then has to die, and the state declare they have to die. What happened with this spirit? They don't want to die because they did some crime, right?
Yeah.
And what happened in these cases?
Every case is
I think every case is a case.
It's
different, right? If that person got a capital punishment, there's so many variables again of why that person got a capital punishment that will be hard for us to dictate and say everyone that has a capital punishment will go through A, B, and C.
Yeah, but has a consequence or not has a consequence?
Everything there's a consequence.
For sure there will have a consequence.
Yeah.
Every cause, there's an effect.
Capital punishment is place by place.
Yeah.
And if you commit a crime that could incur in capital punishment in a place that there is capital punishment, your conscience is clear that you're putting your life in risk, right?
And always remembering that God's justice is perfect.
Yeah.
Because we know of cases of innocent people who have died in capital punishment. They were judged and accused and sentenced unfairly. But again, we need to remember that God's justice is perfect. Yeah. Nothing is by chance.
And in general terms, people that have deaths related to that, they will have that state of confusion, and they will not, at first, will not understand that they are actually dead. So in addition to that state of confusion, there's Kardec in question 257 talks about how does the spirit feel? What are the sensations that the spirit will go through after taking their life, in this case of suicide, so violently and abruptly. A suicide once said to us, "No, I'm not dead," and added, "Yet I can feel the worms devouring me." Of course, the worms were not devouring the perispirit, let alone the spirit, but only the body. Since the separation between the body and the perispirit was not yet complete, remember that cord, too much energy still there and abruptly cut, that separation has not been completed yet. There continued to be a mental repercussion that transmitted the sensation to the body. So the spirit believed that he's still alive, and everything that is happening to the body, he can feel. But it's just a mental repercussion. He or she creates those sensations and transfer to them. But it's not actually happening. Yeah. Again, that situation described for suicide, but a person that is too materialistic might face similar issues. Yeah. So those are some of what the Spirit's book talks about in those cases of suicide and sudden death. So let's now work a little bit of the example which was provided to us by Ivone Pereira through the book Memoirs of Suicide, where she describes Camilo Castelo Branco, what he went through after committing suicide. So it's important to say that this book, and I was kind of watching my lecture last year, Ivone has a very, it's a different type of psychography, right? Because I haven't had the opportunity yet to read the full book, but I read some key passages from Alirio's book, Suicide False Solution. And you can see that it's very realistic. It's very graphic. And Alirio made a comment that caught my attention, saying some people were just like, I don't want to see this. This is too much, right? And it's important to say that there is a purpose of being that way. Camilo Castelo Branco would not be authorized, if we want to use that word, to do that without being authorized by the superior spirits, right? Without being authorized even for Mary Nazareth to help Ivone write a book like this, to help those that are thinking, or to serve, this book should serve as a mechanism of learning, right? If we have those feelings, or I just don't want to see this, this is too much, sometimes we might have had some of those feelings, maybe not in this life, but maybe in other lives. And I think personally, even if it's too graphic, it really paints a good picture. It's just realistic of what happens, right? And makes us to reflect, and makes us to understand the real consequences if deciding to practice this act.
Just to add your point, her mediumship, and this is an introduction of the book as well that she clarifies, is she was brought to the places so she could crystal
some
clear
vivid scenes,
and also feel what Camilo was feeling in that moment of his life. So that's why it's so real, and that's at the same time surreal. When talking about the Suicide Valley or stuff like this. That the point of those vivid scenes, right? And we're gonna see some of those vivid scenes in short passages.
But just to give a little bit of a background, Camilo Castelo Branco was one of the famous writers, poets of the time, and he took his own life by shooting his head. So, but what happened with Camilo? So, Camilo, as you can see in this picture, he shot himself in the temple, and as you can see in the perispirit, that damage caused in the body is transfer to the perispirit. And as through all the description of Camilo, he keeps emphasizing and describing that blood coming from the temple never ceased. It was always there. But that is just how the spirit, because the spirit has so much vital energy, so it keeps translating what happens when he or she took his or her life. It keeps showing that image. Replaying that image. If people, for example, commit suicide by hanging, they keep feeling that a feeling of the rope, right? Asphyxiated or without breath. Try to lose because they keep painting that image from the moment they committed suicide.
Lots of pain.
Lots of pain.
And then you say the spirit has a feeling. Is it you say?
Yeah. It because he projects, he uses that energy that he still has.
For the energy they have. Right?
Yeah.
No.
Not the energy that he has. The vital.
She asked you all for eternity.
Oh, not for eternity. It's for a period of time that I'm going to explain. Not for eternity. No.
Not for eternity.
No.
but they feel like the sensation.
Yes.
The spirit.
The spirit is basically, from what he was saying, this vital energy that was in our body. Mm-hmm. It was, for example, for me to disincarnate at 60 years old, 60. But I took my life with 30. So usually, this extra 30 years, there is a huge connection between the perispirit and the body that's already in the tomb. Mm-hmm. Is it clear?
Yeah. And do you guys know, I think most of you know why he took his life? It's because he became blind, right? And he didn't want to go through the blindness, which was an expiation that he agreed, I believe he agreed to incarnate, but he decided not to go through that expiation of blindness. When he found out he would be blind, he decided to took his life. So let's, I'm going, as I progress through, I'm going to share some of the passages in kind of three phases. So the first, the description as soon as he took his life away. Then, when he was, through the divine mercy, transferred to the valley of the suicide. And then, for last, when he was at the Hope City receiving treatment. So I'm going to cover pieces of those three phases. So the first hours that follow my brutal act against myself passed by without me being able to get a hold of myself. My spirit, cruelly violated, sort of fainted, suffering an ignoble collapse. It's interesting, he keeps saying, human language has not felt the need to invent words exact and clear enough to define the absolutely inconceivable impressions that start to contaminate the self of a suicide in the early hours following the tragedy. I felt an iciness penetrating my whole being. I was shivering. So remember when I just talked about question 165 and 257, where the spirit starts feeling all the things that are happening to the body. So Camilo is just describing what the spirits, through the book of the spirits, mention. There's so much vital energy in him, and he was so still connected to the body that he was portraying, using that energy and thinking that he was suffering all of that. Everything that was happening to the body was happening to him. Yes, to the spirit, exactly. That is resulted because of the violent death. And the spirit deceptively believed that he had not yet died. The spirit believed that he hasn't died. And we're going to see through Camilo's narrative the great difficulty that he experienced as soon as he did that, and to understand what he had done. And he who thought that taking his life away would cure the blindness, he was still blind after he passed away. Right? He thought that I'm going to take my life, my blindness will be cured, and I'll solve my problem. But he was blind. And there are passages where he would say that he couldn't see. He was just touching or trying to walk around touching things because he was still blind. And if you go back to question 950 something that I forgot, it's just the reinforcement of that big disappointment, right? Because he tried to he killed himself because to get away blind, but he was still blind after that.
Not only he did not die, but he was still blind.
Yes.
That's when
he took away his life.
Yeah, I know. He was, because he was blind.
Yeah.
That's why he shouldn't, right?
Yes.
So, but when he come back to the life in other body, or
no. As soon as he took his life away,
in the spirit.
The spirit was blind. Exactly. That
because
just
again,
reinforces.
He was connected to the body.
He was connected, exactly.
The body was blind.
Yeah.
And what happened in the other life? They're gonna born again, blind.
Then there's so.
What happened?
Yeah.
He's gonna get there.
Yeah. I won't get there too much because I haven't read, and I honestly don't know what happens to Camilo after when he will have to expiate and will have to repair. I honestly, I don't know because I haven't read, but that's on my next book reading for sure. So now I just explained a little bit of what happens right after. Now let's talk a little bit about what is mentioned in the book of the Valley of the Suicide. So this is at the time that he was brought there. I found myself being held in an area of the invisible world. Its desolate landscape comprised deep valleys that were continuously enveloped in shadowy darkness. Within its winding gorges and sinister caves, spirits that used to be men and women on the earth howled. Is that the right? Howled. Like hordes of infuriated demons, demented by the absolutely unconceivable intensity and strangeness of the suffering that tormented them. So we see that this is a very unhappy place, right? And the description actually of this is very similar to the description, for example, that André Luiz provides when he's describing where he went to the realm. So those places actually, a lot of what happens in those places are just mental projections that those spirits that are brought there are just producing, using that energy kind of to replicate what happened to them. In the example of Camilo, because he took his life and with the shot in the temple, he always is using the energy that's still in him to portray that accident again. And he describes that sometimes people that were committed suicide by putting fire on, not putting fire, or
Set on fire.
set them on fire. We could see that people running from the fire, but are just mental creations that they did, and all those people, all those that are there are kind of the same kind of energy, right? And they could see, how do you say plasma? How or how do you?
It's plasma as well.
It's
Like
they just
resonate.
yeah, or
Yeah,
they
like
just
not materialized, but
yeah. All of them would kind of make that image, and that image will be seen by everybody in that area.
like a projector.
Yes. They would project that, exactly. Yeah. Because, again, and they would kind of still have some of those feelings that they would have, like hunger. I always have a hard time. Hunger, thirst, freezing cold. Again, because they're still with that vital energy in them.
And it's non-stop.
It's non-stop, exactly.
So one image after other continuously.
Yeah, I think there is also an example of a person who threw himself under a train, right?
Yes.
And he kept reliving the
Reliving
scene
the
over
scene.
and over and over
Yeah,
again.
yeah, exactly. It's a pretty intense, and as I mentioned, not a happy place. However, it's very interesting. Why do we have that, right? If we think about God as pure love and compassion, there's gotta be a reason for that to exist, right? And Leon Denis starts talking, and he gives his impression and explain why this valley of suicides exists. It's actually a divine mercy. Leon Denis said, after death, before the spirit gets hold of itself, gravitating toward the true spiritual home that it deserves, it has to undergo a phase in a kind of empty room, in a like waiting room, a room before we go to a better place, let's call it. In a region whose density and local afflictive configurations correspond to the newly discarnated vibrational state. So everybody, all those spirits that committed suicide, they are in the same vibration state. And it's necessary that they go there to get rid of that vital energy. That needs to be released. That needs to be done before they move to the next stage of their not reparation, at a better place.
But they have to go there first. They have to.
It is.
Everybody, they have to.
No.
It's
No,
interesting.
no,
It's not all.
No,
I
no.
was not able
People
to.
who took their life, they have to go there in this place, in the valley.
We cannot say that they have to,
No.
right? No. I tried to find an answer to that based on when we did our meetings. I could not find a defined answer saying 100% of people that committed suicide go there. I cannot reassure saying 100% will go there. There might be different cases where some spirit might not even be able to go there.
Alerting and mitigating circumstances.
Yeah.
Yes,
So-
depending
Depends.
of all those variables.
Yeah, I ask you because I understand, I hear the consequences, right?
Mm-hmm.
If they do something wrong, they have to have the consequences, right?
You see, there is no punishment.
Yeah,
It's not God punishing.
it's actually a God
It's
mercy.
just a mind state that the spirit is that group him with other spirits
Yeah.
at the same level of consciousness. That's why there are many suicides there.
The same level.
The same type of mentality,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
level of conscience. But there are ways to relieve it. Yes, there are some spirits that their responsibility for the act wasn't as much as others, and that they may not go to a deep umbral or suicide valley if you want. They might be a lighter one because they're conscious, but it all depends. Imagine yourself now. My mom used to say to me, I know you by the type of people you relate with. This is for incarnated. Now imagine yourself as a spirit, and it's way easier to connect with spirits that are on the same type of level of conscious as you. Then what will happen, we will group together in a place, and that place might be a spiritual colony or a suicide valley.
Yeah. And the suicide valley actually exists to protect the spirit, because Camilo describes that after he just committed suicide, he was kind of wandering, and until he finds that group that was about 200 people that were just being gathered to be taken to the suicide valley. So imagine if he hadn't had that opportunity to be taken to the suicide valley, which it is protected as well from the energy or the spirits that are very, they're evil, and they want to do even worse with that spirit that committed suicide. So that suicide valley is also protected for them, for their own benefit.
And another point that's important to say is these valleys, they are spirits, they are grouped together.
Yeah.
Based on their language and culture as well.
Yeah.
So that makes things better for them.
So Camilo describes that where he went, it was Brazil, Portugal, Spain, and countries that were colonized, countries in Africa that were colonized by Portuguese. Again, the divine mercy putting together people that had kind of a similar culture in the same place.
All related to the law of affinity.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are some descriptions. There's a spirit called Anselmo, which they were kind of in a tower, and that tower is always monitoring everything that is happening. They have like sophisticated equipments that monitors if a spirit that is in the suicide valley and that vital energy has been completed, they know when to call the lancers that I'm going to talk about to pick up that spirit and take that spirit to their next stage of repair. And then the divine mercy, Camilo talks about the legion of servants of Mary. So the suicides are Mary of Nazareth. It's the what's the word in English? The guidance. Maybe it's kind of quote unquote responsible to take care of all the suicides. And he describes, suddenly, from within the dense and dark surroundings, the white vehicles appeared, dispersing the darkness with their powerful spotlights. The caravan stopped on the muddy square. A regiment of lancers stepped out. Immediately thereafter came men and women who looked like nurses, and then the same head of previous expeditions in his Hindu turban and tunic. So this divine mercy, at that point, Camilo was ready to move to his next stage of repairment after committing suicide. So this describes the moment he was being taken to what we call the Hope City. And all those lancers work under Mary of Nazareth. And I also, there's a quote that Guy used in his first workshop that we had, saying, "For a long time now I have commended to my mother," Jesus saying, "for only maternal inspiration is sufficiently charitable to uplift them towards God." Only that maternal love that Mary of Nazareth have, it's the inspiration and required to bring those that committed suicide towards God.
Deep compassion.
Yeah, deep compassion. So now let's talk a little bit the repercussions after he was rescued. So after a deep and restorative sleep, somehow perceived that my thoughts were becoming clearer, more capable of understanding and comprehending the circumstances. This mental invigoration only deepened rather than mitigated my torment, because it compelled me to examine with greater serenity the depth of the act I had committed against myself. Again, he's still kind of working on that disappointment, right? He's going to a better situation, but that disappointment of grief, terror, it's still there. So Aliro mentions that even the person that commits suicide might have all the help, but it will always encounter that disappointment. It will be up to that spirit to go through that path of figuring out and expiating and reparation. We did see individuals disfigured by the evil they still... So this is a passage that it was very intense, and the only reason I decided to keep and talk about it, because here Camilo was taken into other sectors of the hospital, and he sees those spirits that committed indirect suicide and how they are after doing that. So we did see individuals disfigured by evil they still bore inside themselves as the calamitous result of their excess, right? Alcohol, sex, and so many others. Dads, weeping, suffering, disheartened, their altered, ugly, sad features still portray the tragic scenes of the sinister valley. Astral configuration display the masks of the marks of vices that they had succumbed to. And Camilo describes that he were still able to smell the tobacco scent as he was taking into this tour to see the consequences of those that committed suicide by vices. However, in addition to the divine mercy from the valley of the suicide, Mary of Nazareth, and all the love and compassion from God, there's a future, right? The spirit committed that suicide, and he or she will need to faces the consequences of that act. And I want to bring chapter 7, item 9 from the Heaven and Hell. Every fault committed, every evil deed accomplished is a debt that must be paid. If it be not paid in the present earthly life, it will be paid in the next one or in the subsequent ones. Time, it's us. We will make that decision, right? On how to perform what the heaven and hell mentions. There are 3 conditions that we have to go through in order to repair those debts. First is repentancy or regret, right? Then we need to go through the expiation, and then we go to reparation. So the book says if repentancy was the only condition, it would be kind of I would just forgive and everything is fine. Yeah, so I'm sorry. So it requires more. However, repentancy kind of paves the way, makes it easier when you regret and you analyze, you reflect the act that you did. It will make it easier for you to expiate, right? Whatever happened or whatever expiation that you need to go through to annul and to quote unquote pay that debt, and then the reparation to do the good that you were supposed to do. And I want to end with some lessons that Camilo mentioned towards the end. Suicides are morally delinquent spirits that fail to honor the commitments they made before the wise, just and immutable laws established by the Creator. So suicide, as Renata mentioned at the beginning, is going against of the law. They will be obliged to repair their earthly experience in a new body, since they destroyed the one that the law conferred on them as an instrument to aid in the conquest of their own self-perfection. Our body, a sacred deposit that they should have cared for and respected, rather than destroy it. Those spirits, they had no right to avoid the great commitments of the planetary life. Commitments they accepted before birth, and in the presence of their own conscience and the divine fatherhood that gave them life and the means to live it. Spirits of suicide will return to the earthly bodies in highly afflictive, suffering conditions, aggravated by the consequences of the great imbalance that desperate gesture calls in their astral body or the perispirit. The return of suicide to physical bodies is the law, the unavoidable law. The return is an irremediable expiation to which they must submit, willingly or not, because for their own good there is no other recourse but the repetition of the plan that they deserted without having completed. And I just want to leave with this message. This is so because you are a light of inestimable value created by the Eternal Father, who pours out his immortality on all creation, which has emanated from him, granting you the blessings of progress down through the ages until you reach the plenitude of glory in final union with him. Thank you.
There's some time for the questions. Don't
Yeah.
rush. I still have to.
Okay. Questions that I